Well, welcome everyone. We're so happy that you could join us for this special session. Tonight's program is part of Archives Month, a holiday you may not have celebrated before, but you'll be celebrating with us here tonight. In addition to this program, we have many things throughout the month, both at the Library of Virginia, where I work, and then also really throughout Virginia itself, throughout the Commonwealth. I do want to encourage you to go to our website for Archives Month 2024. The link is there in the chat. I want to take a moment also to show you our incredible zines that we've produced as part of Archives Month. Each year we pick a new theme, and this year our theme was Archives Are for Self-Expression. So in addition to last year's Archives 101, we now have an excellent zine giving you some tips about fair use and how you can use all these wonderful things in the archives. So much more than can fit into a small pamphlet. We have information for you this evening from our expert, Brandon Butler, who is here to share his knowledge with us, and I'll pass it over to him now. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
All right, everybody. Good evening. Happy Archives Month. It's lovely to be here with you all. My name's Brandon Butler. A little about me. I am a copyright lawyer by training. I went to law school here in Virginia, at the University of Virginia. And for the vast majority of my career, I've been working sort of in and around libraries. My wife is a librarian, and I've had my clients. One of my first clients was the Association of Research Libraries, and I worked there for many years. I've taught in the law school at American University in the law clinic there, where I supervised students who took real cases. And probably the latest turn that my career has taken is to take me out of the UVA library where I worked recently and into the world of television, movies, podcasts, and books, where I'm consulting with and advising filmmakers, producers, authors on how to use fair use when they're working with archival materials and other materials. So I have like a super duper selfish motive here, which is my clients depend on you now, right? I used to be the one on the other side saying, what does this filmmaker want? What do they want to do? What are they trying to do? But now I'm on the side of the filmmaker, and I can tell you from intense firsthand experience just how much filmmakers love archives and value this material. It is, having a good archival producer is a game changer. It makes the film from sort of B minus to A plus, right? It can be the difference in a kind of okay film to a really remarkable film is the quality of archival material that's in there. And so it matters a lot, getting access to this material and then being confident that you can use it lawfully. And my focus this evening is going to be talking to you all about, from the filmmaker's point of view, what would we like to find, right, in the archives, and what kinds of archival practices are most helpful for the users as they're trying to use their fair use rights. So I'm going to share my slides with you now. Fingers crossed. It worked 7 minutes ago. Haha. And here we are. So my theme for you tonight, fair use in the archives, right? One weird trick to unlock creative use of archival materials by filmmakers, teachers, and others. And I use the one weird trick, that sort of clickbait formula. And by the way, that's Yazzie Butler. That's my law firm. If anybody ever has, if you're talking to someone who has questions about how to do this stuff, send them our way. We love talking about it. We love helping people. So, it's usually the one weird trick doesn't work, right? There is no one weird trick to blast belly fat or one weird trick to make $10,000 a week working in your basement. But the fair use weird trick really works. And I want to tell you a little bit about it. So I'm going to start there. Here's a sort of roadmap for tonight. I'm going to start with copyright and fair use. How does copyright set the table for all of this stuff? And then how does fair use help us get things done in the archive? I'll show you some examples of fair use in action so that you can kind of actually see what fair use looks like in this, with archival materials, with found materials. And then, really the coup de grace and the most important part is how archives can help fair users, what archives can do um, to ensure that the materials in the archive really are, maximally available and useful to the next generation of creators. And, in that list, the three key items are to gather and share as much source information as you can and to be available to answer questions, to avoid, entanglements from donors and others, and to avoid adding your own layers of sort of, fear, uncertainty, and doubt and control. So we'll talk through each of those in turn. So first, copyright in a nutshell. And boy, is this ever in a nutshell? I've literally, I could teach this. It usually takes a semester, but you're getting the 5-minute version here. Copyright is the exclusive right to copy, distribute, publicly perform, publicly display, and create derivative works of a protected expressive work, right? And copyright attaches these days automatically as soon as any expressive work is what we call fixed in a tangible medium or written down, right? And so as you all no doubt know, if you work in libraries and archives are just giant buildings full of copyrighted stuff, right? That's why I've been able to, I haven't run out of things to do working on copyright in the library and archive world. Um, Another thing to know about copyright is it's the term of copyright is very long, and that's what that little chart on the right shows. It shows how the copyright term has grown over the years. And so initially at the founding era, 1790 Act, copyright lasted for 14 years. And, if by some miracle the author lived to be older than 30, maybe they could get 14 more if they filed the right paperwork and get 28 years total, period, end of story. And then what we see what the chart represents is extension, extension, extension. Copyright term gets longer and longer and longer. So that nowadays, if I encounter something in the archives, I know that it's going to be, encumbered by copyright. If it was published less than 95 years ago, I have to assume it's encumbered by copyright, although there are lots of ways it might not be. But, as a starting assumption, if it's, published less than 95 years ago, or if it was an unpublished thing, then I have to figure out, okay, well, when did the author die? And then add 70 years to that date. And so you can have items that, were sort of created at the turn of the 20th century that could still be in copyright because, the author lived another 50 years and then 70 years from that, and suddenly you're in, 2040, 2050. So long terms, lots of stuff is in copyright. The other thing about copyright, in terms of, why we should basically assume that most things in the archive that are, less than 100 years old raise a copyright question. And the other thing about it is nowadays, meaning in my lifetime, since 1978, there have not been very many meaningful formalities required to get copyright, protection under federal law. So anything that is written down is automatically under federal copyright law. And this is retroactive for things that were not published. And again, we're talking about archives here, right? So things that were, created and stuffed in a drawer again, at the turn of the 20th century, may very well still be under copyright because there was no requirement to register your copyrights or put a notice on it or do anything. You get to have a copyright sort of automagically. So what all this adds up to is when we find something in an archive, if it is from 1900 forward, we have to start from the assumption that copyright applies unless we can find a good reason to take copyright out of the picture. That's why it's important to have something like fair use. And I call it the right of fair use, and it's not just me. That's actually what it's called in the copyright law. If you go to Section 108 in the Copyright Act, it says nothing in this section shall affect the right of fair use. Okay. So, fair use right. And it is a flexible, judge-made right to use in copyright material under certain circumstances without payment, without permission. And I say flexible because it doesn't have any, numerical limitations. If you look at some of the other parts of the Copyright Act, the parts about libraries and archives in particular, you might see something like only 3 copies. You can make 3 copies and that's it. There's nothing about how many copies or what percentage, only, less than 20%. You might read those kinds of things, online. They're not true. That's not how fair use works. There's no numbers, there's no, magic threshold. It is a flexible right. It's a judge-made right because it was actually originally created using the common law powers of judges in England and America in the 18th century and 19th century. That's when judges would encounter a copyright case and they would say, well, in this case, yes, copyright applies. This work was in copyright. You made a copy. Ordinarily, that would be a violation of the rights holder's exclusive rights. But in this case, we think it's fair. We think that what you've done is actually fair. And so we're not going to enforce copyright in this case. And those judicial decisions built up over time until there was a body of law that established the sort of broad outlines of fair use. And then in 1976, the Congress codified fair use, wrote it into the Copyright Act, and that's the law that we have today. And the other interesting thing to know about fair use, it's flexible, it's judge made. It's also a First Amendment right. So back in the 1990s, the sort of bad old days in some ways for copyright, when a lot of bad law was being made, there was a challenge to the last big extension of copyright term when copyright got 20 years longer, right? It got 20 years longer. So it went from life plus 50 to life plus 70. Mickey Mouse was saved for another couple of decades. And there was a challenge to that extension, right? Lawrence Lessig and some other sort of academics and activists for the public domain, they brought a lawsuit and said, look, you can't shrink the public domain in this way. It's unconstitutional. And unfortunately, the court said, well, yeah, you can. So, we lost that. We lost that. The court said you can extend it as many times as you want, as long as it's not literally infinite. But the court also said that within the copyright system, there must be, in order to protect free expression, some safety valves to allow for use without permission, right? And some of those safety valves, are, for example, that facts and ideas are not protected by copyright. So I can read a book, I can learn facts, and I'm free to repeat those facts, right? I can take what I learn, write my own book, right? But another important safety valve is fair use. I can literally copy, distribute, etc., protected material if my use is a fair use. To figure out whether a use is fair, the statute tells us, and the courts have told us, that we apply a 4-factor test. And these 4 factors are: what is the purpose of your use? So why are you doing this? Why is this material being quoted in your essay or your song or your film? What is it doing here? What is the nature of the work that you've used? Is it published or unpublished, creative or more factual? How much did you take? And a lot of times when people talk about fair use, they focus on that. And it's this idea that, oh, well, less is always better, more is always worse, and fair use is like getting away with something because it's small. That's not the way the law works. There are dozens of cases that involve taking entire works. And in fact, there are a few cases that involve copying millions of works, cases about search engines and book search, for example. And so the question of amount isn't, less is better, more is worse. It's, is the amount you're using appropriate to your fair use purpose? And then finally, the fourth factor is the effect of your use on the market. What is your use a substitute for the work to the consumers that would ordinarily buy the work or license it or whatever, right? And so those are the four factors. It turns out those four factors aren't as helpful as you'd like them to be. Courts kind of struggled in applying those four factors. The law wasn't very consistent for a long time. In the 1970s and 80s, as the fair use statute was being codified and the courts were sort of reacting to that, lots of confusion. Happily, in 1994, the heroes of this story, who I should have put a picture of them in here, but I'll talk about this case in a minute. It's a good case with the sandals. The heroes of our story are Two Live Crew, the hip hop group, who incidentally yesterday they won a lawsuit where they can take their copyrights back from their record label. So these guys are no stranger to copyright. They keep fighting the good fight. Maybe not music you should play for your children, but Two Live Crew had a song that was sort of based on or riffing on Pretty Woman, Oh Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison. And the Supreme Court in 1994 was asked to decide whether their version, their sort of Pretty Woman, which was a rap version, it was really raunchy. It was about kind of like actually an ugly woman. And was that a fair use of the music and the kind of lyrical skeleton of the Orbison song, right? And the court, in deciding that case, uh, created this sort of category that they borrowed from an important scholar and judge named Pierre Laval, transformative use. And the court said, when we're trying to make sense of a use and determine whether it's a fair use, really the most important thing, the thing that we're really looking for, the uses that they say are at the heart of fair use, are the transformative uses. And a transformative use is a use for a new purpose with a new meaning, a new message, not a superseding or substitutional use, but rather, something that creates creates new information, new insight, without unfairly substituting for the original. And the court said, Pretty Woman, the Two Live Crew song is not really a substitute for the Roy Orbison song. Nobody's going to walk into the record store and say, well, the Two Live Crew CD is $8 and the Roy Orbison CD is $10. It's basically the same. I'll get Two Live Crew, right? They're not the same. But also they said the Two Live Crew song is commenting on and making fun of the Roy Orbison song. And commenting and making fun of something is a valuable new purpose. And importantly, you kind of can't do it without quoting and invoking the thing you're making fun of, right? It's an important part of parody that you need to bring in and conjure up the original in order to trash it and make it seem stupid, right? And so that's what the court said that it thought Two Live Crew was doing with the Roy Orbison song, saying, Pretty Woman, that's really naive. It's the 90s now. Well, we don't respect women anymore, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, different message from Roy Orbison. And so once the courts decide that a use is transformative, they ask whether the amount that you've taken for your transformative purpose is the right amount given what your purpose was, right? And so again, with a parody, the question is, did you take an amount that was appropriate to conjure up the thing you're making fun of, but maybe not more than that, right? Or, too much. And that's kind of how the courts do it. The art that you see there on the slide is maybe a more easily sort of digestible illustration of fair use and of transformative fair use in particular. These images are from a case called Blanche v. Coons. And in this case, the photographer, Blanche, had taken this art image, this sort of, well, this artful, kind of nicely framed. It's not an art image, actually. It's an advertising image. It was in a fashion magazine. And it was a spread, about this season's heels, right? And Jeff Koons, the sort of, the modern artist, the appropriation artist, had cut out, used a kind of a cutout collage effect and taken these shoes, flipped them over, and you see them in his work below that, his mural, which is called Niagara. And it has multiple kind of fashionable, interesting women's legs and feet juxtaposed with these images of food. And it was a gigantic kind of like fine art mural. And the court said, this is radically different from a magazine spread trying to sell you shoes, right? This is a new creative purpose. It's a new work. Nobody's going to say, oh, I forgot to buy this month's issue of Vogue. I guess I'll go buy Jeff Koons's, $70 million painting. It's a different work. It's not a substitute. And that's what transformative use is all about. Now I'm going to get close to home here. This is one of my clients. You might have seen this series on PBS earlier this year. It's this wonderful series. You can probably still stream it on the PBS app. It's called Gospel, about the history of gospel music and gospel preaching. And this sequence is about the Reverend J.M. Gates and his sermon / song, Say Goodbye to the Chain Stores. And if you watch this, you'll see some pretty interesting uses of archival material. And then we can talk about why those are fair uses. So let me start.
Managed women? Did you spend Christmas in jail? But we also have sermons such as Say Goodbye to the Chain Stores, which is a tremendously progressive and prophetic sermon. In 1929, chain stores were dominating America, and many people felt that they were actually the cause of the Great Depression.
I want you to listen. Then I want you to put it into action. Stay out of these chain stores.
I'm going to pause this for a hot second. Watch everything that's happening on this screen. It is all archival material. These are archival images, photographs, newspaper clippings. Also, what you're hearing is a sound recording that is, 100 years old. But because of the wild, wacky way that sound recording copyright works, probably still in copyright. You're seeing the lyrics on the screen. Again, those are protected by copyright, not the words of the sermon. And then once he starts to sing, you'll see the lyrics of the song. So all of this material is arguably under copyright. All of it came from the archive. So let's keep watching.
When you come to town, spend your money with people who will give you credit. Spend your money with the people who give you a job. I'm telling you this for your good. And now, boys, I want you to sing. That true thing about these chains, oh Lord, you'll find it to be true. Lord, they do not give you work to do, and they will not credit you. Now let me tell you, people, Lord, the best thing for this land, Lord, better stay out of these chains.
He is being entertaining, but he's also being political. I just love the way he read the culture. What's going to happen to black people when the mom and pop stores disappear? He's saying so managed.
Yeah, I love that whole sequence. But as I say, you know, everything in it is fair use. And it better be because I signed a letter and got them insured. And I believe it. I believe it. It's true. And they've been shown on PBS. And the reason that using all of these materials is a fair use is because, of course, we're telling a new story here, right? These headlines are historical artifacts. This is old news. You know, we're not competing unfairly with anybody's newspaper, but in fact, we're telling a new story about chain stores, a story most people don't know, and a story that you might not believe if you didn't see firsthand primary source evidence of what a real phenomenon this was, that chain stores are bad for African Americans because they will not give credit, they will not hire them in the way that small mom and pop and locally owned stores would at the time. I had no idea. I had no idea, but it was such a huge phenomenon that you've got sermons about it, songs about it, newspaper articles, protests, and these archival snapshots and photos that show people, lining up at the store, protesting the store, and so on. All of these help to tell the story. And that story is a new story, right? It didn't exist before. And it's made up of these sort of raw ingredients that are turned to a new purpose in the narrative. And that's sort of the heart and soul of fair use. This series couldn't exist without fair use, couldn't exist without archives, couldn't exist. And this, all of the amazing work that Henry Louis Gates does, right, in this sort of telling these stories relies so heavily on getting into the archives, finding the primary sources, and sharing them under fair use. So when we are in the archive and we know we're looking for material, we need to tell a new story, we need to rely on fair use, most likely to tell that story, because archival materials often we don't know who wrote them, or we can't find that person, or we couldn't afford to license all this stuff if there was somebody willing to take money. And increasingly, our friends at Getty will take your money for just about anything, whether they own it or not. So for a million good reasons, we need to be able to exercise our fair use rights. And so what are some of the things that archives can do, or that, frankly, that archives do already, but that you should recognize the good practices that most archives do as a matter of professionalism, also are hugely helpful and valuable for fair users. And so that's why we're so grateful for archives for all the work you do. The most important thing is, gathering and sharing as much information as you can about the work in your collection. Because, and of course you do that for a million good reasons. Let me tell you why it's important for fair use. Fair use, again, is really all about transformation, right? It's about what is my purpose, and is that different from the purpose for which this thing was originally made? And so if I want to know, is my use fair? Is it transformative? I need to know, what was this thing originally? Like, who made it? Why? Who published it? Where? When? What were their goals? What were their, was this a commercial entity? Did it have a commercial purpose? When was it published, so that I can get a sense of the time period and whether it's really relevant to my story, because that relevance is a part of the fair use argument. I have to say, well, this is the right, these are the newspaper articles that Reverend J.M. Gates was reading when he wrote that song. And I know that because they're from the era, right? So when was it from? And really any context information that you can gather, that stuff is solid gold for us. not just because it helps us pick things that are useful and relevant, and that's probably the most important thing, but then when it comes time to figure out, is this a fair use? Can we really do this, or will we get in some kind of copyright trouble? Knowing this information tells us what we need to know so we can make a good fair use calculation. So just crucial stuff. And there's good metadata is just solid gold for a fair use lawyer and for a filmmaker. There's really no such thing as too much information. So, this image of Duke Ellington from the Library of Congress, God bless the Library of Congress. They have really good information when we source materials from there. You get the name of the photographer, you get the date it was created, but you also get a sense of when was it bought, how did it come into the library in the Record Changer, Volume 5, Number 12, right? So, okay, so it was maybe published in a magazine. That's helpful. That's useful. That tells me something about what the purpose of this item was. It tells me, was this material purchased and so on, right? Super helpful. And then, oh my goodness, isn't this nice? At the bottom, there's a nice little rights advisory. And if you can do that, that's great. And you may save us a fair use calculus if you can tell us something like this, which is Mr. Gottlieb dedicated these works to the public domain. Well, that's really lovely, but that's rare. That's rare. And again, this is kind of the dream. If you know enough to know, what information about this material might specifically help me understand the rights issues, boy, we love to see that. Because again, it helps us know, do we need to do a fair use analysis or not? And is there somebody out there, looking to sell this image or not, and so on. So yeah, the metadata is just good as gold. The other thing that's really nice is, for there to be folks who work in the archive who are really knowledgeable about specific collections. If we say, oh, I'm looking to use I want to use some footage from your collection of sort of mid-century home videos. But the language on the website, I can't quite tell what it means when you say, this is the person who shot it, but there may be other people involved. Can you tell me more? Right? So having somebody who's available and able to help, answer questions is actually hugely helpful for fair use. We send clients back to the archive all the time, all the time. It's an extremely common outcome of our first conversation is, okay, that's great. Thank you. Here's a bunch of items where we'd like you to go back to the archive and learn more about what they are. Okay, so listen, I'm sort of telling you to do your job there with all that stuff, right? You guys already know gathering that information is just good practice and it's good for all kinds of reasons. Here's some things that might not be so obvious. Please avoid what I would call donor entanglements. And I make that plea, and I know again that's something, every library I've ever worked with or for does this anyway for all kinds of good reasons. But from a fair use point of view, the reason this is important is that fair use is really powerful, right? It really is that one weird trick. If your use is fair, you don't need permission, all copyright complications fall away. You don't have to know who the author is. You don't have to find them. You don't have to pay them. Life is good, right? If your use is a fair use. But fair use cannot help you if you get caught up in a contract that says, oh, if I use this, I promise I'll pay, $200 to this donor, or I'll ask them before I use it. Fair use doesn't overcome a contractual obligation. And so if a library enters into a contractual obligation with a donor and they say, oh, we won't let anybody use this without first asking you if it's okay, or we won't let anybody have a copy of this without asking you if this is okay. Those kinds of barriers to access, they circumvent fair use, right? If it weren't for these barriers, fair use would solve all of our problems for us. And good examples here, right? I see this all the time. I saw this when I worked at UVA. oh, the donor wants to know before we let anybody use these materials, or the donor wants a chance to charge a fee, these photographs or whatever, the donor wants to know that somebody's asking for access, and we can't grant access until the donor tells us that's okay. And then this one may be a little less obvious. Donors might say, "Oh, well, I'm happy for people to make, academic uses or scholarly uses or educational uses, but I'm really not comfortable with commercial uses." And I think when people say that, when donors say that, when archivists sort of agree to it, they're imagining like a Taco Bell ad. You know what I mean? Like they're imagining a commercial use, like, I'm going to turn this into an action figure. But I'm here to tell you, a documentary for PBS that's never going to recover the cost of making it is still commercial from a legal point of view, because it is made by people who get paid to make it, and it is sold. And that's enough. So we often, I think, we hear the word commercial and we think, oh, it's crass commercialism. It's an ad. It's a merchandise. And that's not the case. And so when a donor says, oh, I'm happy with non-commercial use, but I really want to be asked before people make a commercial use, remember, every book author, every documentary filmmaker, every podcaster, every TV producer, those are all commercial users as well. And they have fair use rights. But if you have promised the donor that you won't allow commercial uses, those fair use rights are in danger. A few more things that we see, and so far I've been very kind and gentle and loving to my archives friends and family, because so many of you are wonderful. But there are some things that we see that are less great. One thing that you sometimes see is what I call copy FUD, which is to say fear, uncertainty, and doubt about copyright. And when I think of copy FUD, I think of really scary warnings, you can't use this material without obtaining permission. This material is only for your personal use and shall not be available for commercial uses, and so on. Again, these may not be contracts, they may not be binding, but they can be scary. And they can, if a filmmaker doesn't have the good legal advice, if it's a young, an indie producer or something, and they don't have access to somebody like me or Peter, they'll see that scary language and they'll just walk away. Sounds like I can't use this thing. So try not to give warnings that are inconsistent with the law. And again, remember, fair use is going to allow many, many, many lawful uses of materials in the archives. And so it's very difficult to say on a blanket basis, oh, you can only use this for private reasons, or you can only use this for academic reasons. There are many, many purposes other than those two that are fair and lawful. Now, I will say Section 108 of the Copyright Act, for you hardcore copyright nerds, does require scary and frankly false notices to be posted by copy machines and places where people order copies. And you have to do it, and I'm sorry. But if you have these, there's literally a paragraph of language that the Copyright Office wrote, 15, 20 years ago, that you have to use. It's literally not accurate, but you have to do it. So we understand, but again, lawyers like me at least know we can ignore it, to be frank. Second is a phenomenon that I call landlordism. That's my friend Brian Fry, who's a law professor. Don't be a landlord. And it's the urge to sort of control and get permission for things that really are not within your control. And again, sometimes we see, and this is more like maybe historical societies, but smaller collections, but they'll say, oh, no, you don't get to publish this without asking us first. And again, under the copyright law, the owner of a copy doesn't really have the right to to demand permission before someone uses something. believe it or not. So just because you hold the copy in your collection doesn't mean that you get to tell people what they can and can't do in terms of fair use out in the world. But it doesn't stop some people from trying. Resist that urge to exert control. Similarly, resist the urge to take responsibility and worry about what your patrons are going to do. You're literally not responsible for what your patrons do. They are on their own hook. The doctrines of secondary liability and copyright are pretty narrow. Unless somebody works for you or you encourage them to go out and infringe, you're really not responsible for what other people do. And so honestly, it's not your responsibility necessarily. You should, of course, right? For my whole life, part of my job has always been educating people about copyright. But that's not the same thing as saying, I am here to keep you safe and prevent you from misusing things. Instead, honestly, the approach that I would recommend that libraries take is to tell people the truth, which is you are responsible for what you do with our collections materials. And that is for good or ill, right? If you infringe, you infringed, and you could get in trouble for that. But on the other hand, if you fair use, you fair used, and that's great. And copyright loves that, and you should be allowed to do it. And if you empower your patrons to take advantage of their rights and to make their own decisions, you can also trust them to be responsible for the consequences. And that's what I have to say tonight. It's actually, boy, I went through that pretty quickly, but hopefully y'all will have questions and things you want to talk about tonight because I love to talk about this stuff. And that's my information, by the way. I'm Brandon. Usefairuse.com is our snappy website. And I will stop sharing. And I'd love to just chat. I'd love to hear questions you have, concerns, comments.
Thank you,
Reviews.
Brandon. I loved that overview of fair use. And if folks want to drop their questions in the chat, we can address them in order, or if, we're a pretty small group, if you want to even unmute and ask a question, you can do that. Here's our first question. When does copyright apply to items older than 100 years?
Great question. So I can give you some hypotheticals. So the one bit of background information you need to know, right? Until 1978, anything that wasn't published could be protected by copyright, like what was called common law or state law copyright, sort of forever. That is, if you keep a manuscript in the drawer and don't ever publish it, it would not ever, sort of enter federal copyright, and the clock would never start ticking. So it could just sort of stay forever. So in theory, materials that weren't published, materials that were created, for example, in the 18th century, they were some founding era documents. They were kept in a drawer. They weren't published until, let's say, 1950. They get published in 1950. That's when the copyright clock starts ticking, is on publication. And then they get 95 years from 1950. So 2045, right? And that thing was created in what, 1790? So you could have things that are, 200 years old, right? That could still be in copy. It's rare. It's a chain of unlikely events that leads you there, but it can happen.
That's a good question. Something good for our researchers to keep in mind in case they encounter that anywhere in our archives. The second question we have is about the photo you showed of Duke Ellington at the bottom where it said there were rights of privacy and publication that may apply. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. And this is our sort of bread and butter as well, so when you're thinking about, can I use this material? The number one issue is always copyright, always. But hot on its heels are privacy and publicity. mainly privacy. And the right of privacy, right, is, there's not going to be a privacy right in that picture of Duke Ellington and his friends, right? Because none of those people expected that they wouldn't be photographed in that scenario, right? They all knew it. Nobody, that wasn't a hidden camera. But, in other circumstances, you could imagine, materials where, it might be fair use because, you've got a new purpose for using this photograph, let's say an old snapshot, right? A family photo from, the middle of the century. But that snapshot was actually never intended to be public, right? And so whoever was in the snapshot had maybe an expectation of privacy. Now, if they're just opening Christmas presents or doing something innocuous, that's fine. There's no privacy concern if you're not doing something private, doing something where you'd be embarrassed to be revealed, right? But on the other hand, I mean, if it were a sensitive photo that showed someone in a context where they didn't expect to ever be exposed, that's a thing. So that's another layer of questions. The right of publicity doesn't come up so much. It's a right that usually has to do again sort of with advertising, and it's the right that people have sort of not to be associated with advertising or commercial speech in an advertising mode. And so for documentaries and for sort of more editorial narrative works, the right of publicity doesn't come up very much at all.
These are great questions. You all keep them coming. Our next one in the chat is about orphan works and how can we make sure that we're not infringing upon copyright in those cases?
Yeah, so well, good news. So orphan works, first of all, I should say, and I've worked on I've worked on orphan works for years. There have been in the past efforts to legislate about this. The Copyright Office did a study. They had roundtables. I was a participant in those roundtables. I submitted written comments, but nothing ever came of that stuff. And so orphan works isn't a technical term in the law. It doesn't have any significance, specifically in the Copyright Act, technically. But colloquially, what it means is, a work where the copyright owner is either unidentifiable or sort of unlocatable, unfindable, unreachable, right? And so, and I sometimes think of them as like zombie works. An orphan work is like a work that, oh no, it lost its parents, it's bereft. But from a copyright point of view, it's more like being a zombie because if your owner is gone, you probably shouldn't have any copyrights anymore, right? Like the whole point of copyright is that the owner should be interested in making money by selling copies or whatever, right? And so orphan works are works where the owner is apparently not interested, right? The owner's gone, they're not keeping track of this material, you can't find them, you can't locate them. And important caveat, and we go through this literally, all the time. You have to try to find the person, right? Like it's not an orphan work until you do a kind of diligent search. And so if you just sort of say like, oh, that's a weird name, I can't think of where I would even start there, you got to try. You have to try. But if you try and you do sort of reasonable things and you still can't find that person, the best solution that has been proposed to the sort of orphan works problem, what do? We feel like kind of we should ask permission, but we don't know where to go. The best solution is fair use. Because when the owner isn't available then there's a kind of inference that they don't care or they're not impacted by the use. And fair use is in some sense all about uses that are not going to have a negative impact on the ordinary commercial exploitation of the work. And, uses that are essentially harmless from the copyright owner's point of view. And so these are harmless uses. So mostly orphan works can be comprehended as fair uses. And so we often use orphan works in films, and we call those as fair uses.
I will now be referring to these as zombie works, now that we have that very helpful term. So thank you for that. Our next question asks, is there any protective balance between fair use and approving commercial use if there are real concerns about the appropriate public use? I'm thinking of inappropriate, incompetent, cringy, or hateful uses of cultural material.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, the way that copyright works is that it allows someone to grant permission or withhold it within a certain zone of ordinary commercially exploitable uses, right? And so, I take a photograph, I get to decide, nobody can use it to sell a product or what, those are ordinary uses of photographs. Those are ordinary commercial uses. The thing about fair uses is that they are not ordinary commercial uses. They require the user to add value and do something different. And so, sort of by definition, the fair user is someone, who is not intruding on the ordinary use of the work. And so even if the copyright holder doesn't like what they're doing, the whole point of fair use is that you get to do it anyway. And usually, I tell stories, um, uh, you know, those are cases where, for example, it can go the other way, where we had Margaret Mitchell's estate, the author of Gone with the Wind, brought a lawsuit against an African American author who wrote a book called The Wind Done Gone, from the point of view of the enslaved people and formerly enslaved people who were in the story, saying, this is what it was actually like, from their point of view. Margaret Mitchell's estate said, that's an unauthorized derivative work. We get to decide who tells the Gone with the Wind story. And the court said, no, that's a fair use, if you're doing something new and valuable with it. So concerns about appropriate public use in the copyright context have to be sort of couched in that you have to ask sort of, is there a legitimate new purpose here? And so, if the use is incompetent, cringy, or hateful, maybe but then the question still remains, is it fair? And I guess I honestly believe that good fair use practice is generally good artistic practice. When I talk to filmmakers, I sort of tell them, like, trust what you want to do artistically, and it will lead you in the right direction fair use wise, because you'll have a good instinct about what is useful for your story, adding to your story. So my hope would be that sort of the things that we might call cringy or hateful would also probably not pass the fair use test if they were, in other words, if they weren't fair, right? But that would be the limit in terms of what copyright could do to prevent those uses.
So I like what you said about artistic practice sort of leading the makers themselves towards a fair use of these objects, of these materials. But here we have a question from a writer saying, how can they determine how much they can quote from other now deceased people's letters and diaries that were written in the 1940s? And does it matter if you don't identify them by name with the quotes so that they're anonymous? Sort of questions about that in terms of writing.
Yeah. So, I mean, letters and diaries are great sources, great resources. And by the way, when someone dies, they lose their privacy rights. So you don't have to worry about that. There's no you're not intruding into their privacy by publishing things from their diaries. And things written in the 1940s, well, from a copyright point of view, the question would be, when did the person die, right? It gets kind of morbid. And somebody actually, I think it's Oh, somebody has a list, a good list of when people died. The sort of when did people the die the dead author list, and but that's it's an important part of keeping up with copyright stuff. But but to answer the question, you'd ask that same question that you'd apply the same basic fair use standards that we talked about earlier. Is your purpose new, right? So, why are these letters and diaries being published in your new book? So, if you're just publishing like the collected letters of Ernest Hemingway, I'm not super optimistic about your fair use claim, right? There's nothing new there, right? There's no new purpose. You're not adding any explanation. You're not criticizing. You're not adding insights. And a published collection of letters is something that authors and authors' estates do all the time. So there's not a lot of novelty there from you or new value there from you as the author. But on the other hand, if you're engaged in biography, for example, letters and diaries are hugely valuable. We've worked with a scholar recently who was doing a scholarly biography, and the book hasn't come out, so I won't out him yet. But a scholarly biography is totally fascinating and hugely reliant upon letters that no one else has seen. This scholar sort of got unique access to the letters, but it was still his scholarship. I read the book. The letters are important, but it's not a collection of letters. It's a scholarly book that uses the letters as part of the evidence in the story. And so that would be the question for the writer, are these letters and diary entries part of your new story, or are you just reprinting?
I think that transformative use is so important, as you said.
Yeah,
I'm now going to be
absolutely.
selfish and ask a question of my own, and that's if you would advise our creators here with us tonight to look at Creative Commons licenses, if you all are familiar with those. That lets you license your work in a way that is still open and accessible, but has some protections, but not full copyright. Do you think that that's a useful tool for us, or do you think that copyright paired with fair use is enough?
Oh boy, no, I love Creative Commons licenses. That's a great question. Creative Commons licenses are really powerful tools because if you're an author and you want people to use your work, you want, for example, teachers to teach it, or you want reading groups to read it together. And you really don't want everyone who wants to do that to have to ask you first. A Creative Commons license is literally just a way for you as the author to say, anyone who satisfies these simple conditions can use my work, make a copy of my work, put it on the internet, translate it, etc., without having to ask me. And it's been, a hugely valuable way for people to, contribute their work to improve access to knowledge in ways that they care about. Academics use these licenses a lot, because a lot of academics are really writing in order to inform people and to spread their ideas. And so they don't really have any interest in stopping people from sharing their work. And so an open license, a Creative Commons license says, hey, as long as and the conditions are very simple and you can pick and choose which ones you want, all of them require credit. So you have to say, you have to credit me as the author. And then, you can say, I don't want you to make commercial uses without asking me. And so that would be a way to say, listen, if you want to have a little reading group, that's fine. But if you want to sell copies out of the back of your car, talk to me first. And so on, right? And so, yeah, Creative Commons are really powerful tools within copyright. And they're powerful because they do let you do things that fair use wouldn't let you do. It's not a fair use to make 15 copies to give to your friends so they can be part of your reading group. Ordinarily, they have to buy their own copy. But if there's an open license, you can do that.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I'm a big supporter of Creative Commons licenses. I think they're wonderful. There's a very detailed question in the chat that I may have to let you read rather than read it aloud, about different editions of published images.
Ooh, this is a great question. So Caitlin asks essentially, let me rephrase it in a way. So there are something like a woodcut, and especially let's assume, for example, the way the question is phrased, let's assume the original is in the public domain, right? And the question is about, well, it's been reprinted in different editions throughout time, and can I use a newer reprinting because it's a higher quality reprinting? And the thing to know about that is that there is no new copyright that arises from the reprinting or even the copying of the woodcut into a book or whatever. That's just a copy. That's not a new work. So if you have, a simple, a woodcut or a photograph or a art reproduction in 2 dimensions, you know, making that reproduction, making a scan, even a very high quality scan that's kind of like hard to do and expensive, that still doesn't give you a new copyright in the reproduction. And that's one way that museums, more than archives and libraries, museums sometimes will say, oh, this image is copyright, the Ohio Museum of Art. No, it's not. The only copyright there is the underlying artwork, not the reproduction. And so, so the practical answer is absolutely. You can take whatever copy you find that's of the highest quality because the reproductions don't get any new ownership. Only the original copyright matters. So when you've got something in the public domain, you can use the best copy you can find, no matter where you find it.
Thank you for that detailed answer. That does really help. Are there any other questions? Feel free to keep dropping them in the chat. I do have one more that I'll ask, and this came to mind when you were discussing the language that has to be posted near a copy machine by law. And just that whole concept struck me as very old because I'm like, wow, does everyone not just whip out their phone and just take photos of what they want? So I guess my question is, how has digitization and cell phones and good cameras and all of that, just the digital world, changed copyright law or at least copyright practice? Yeah.
It's a great question. It's a great question. The rise of digital tools. On the one hand, I mean, boy, this is like a seminar in terms of how much we could think about this. On one hand, I would say what happened with the sort of the rise of digital tools for copying and sharing is that it created the moral panic that we all lived, well, probably most of us lived through in the sort of 90s and even 2000s about the internet, right? And what happened was the copyright industry said, oh my God, this makes it so easy to create and share perfect copies of our work. No one's ever going to buy anything again, right? And so that hasn't that we've just barely emerged, I would say, from that total freak out that started in the 1990s over digital. And then I mean, the thing that's interesting about digital from, from within the library world is you all know, probably some of you, something that no copyright person, I think, still has ever fully grasped, which is that digital is not forever. And it's not actually a great format, in terms of and so I think, the content industries sort of freaked out and said, oh, once something is digital, it's out there and it's out of our control. And so it's going to be impossible to stop it from spreading around. But on the other hand, digital things are very ephemeral. They disappear all the time. The internet is constantly, sort of eroding and corroding around the edges. Most links are gone. Most links don't work anymore. So there's a funny thing going on there, and copyright never fully understood. Copyright is not very complicated or nuanced, when it comes to digital stuff. And I think we've got a long way to go to reckon with the change that digital has made on the way things are created and shared.
Thank you. I do realize that could have been like the whole topic for tonight. So I appreciate just a little piece of what that means. We do have some more questions coming in the chat, and the first is about fair use in other countries such as the UK and if it still applies there.
Yeah, great question. So there are a few answers to that question. There are always at least three answers to any question, it seems. One is that generally speaking, the law that matters for you is the law where you physically are. So, in other words, when we're advising filmmakers about, or TV producers, or podcasters, or anybody, or libraries about, using material, for example, that might have been created abroad, right? This is a book about, or we're going to make a movie about the Beatles, and it's going to have a lot of stuff from England in it. Does that matter? And the answer, sort of rough and ready answer, is no, it doesn't matter. If you're in America making a film in America, your distribution hub is in America, then the law that matters for you is fair use, because that's the law in America. Another answer to that question is, do other countries have fair use? Is there such a thing as fair use in England? Or, if I moved to England, would I have to learn a whole new way of doing research in the archive, right? And the answer is no, you wouldn't have to learn a whole new way of doing it. But there's not exactly fair use everywhere. There are versions and flavors of it in most countries. In England, there's a doctrine called fair dealing. It's a little narrower than fair use. It's less flexible. It applies in slightly fewer circumstances. In Canada, similarly, they have fair dealing, but fair dealing in Canada is much broader than fair dealing in the UK, and it's about almost as broad as fair use in the US. And every country in the world that is a signatory to an international agreement called the Berne Convention, which is essentially every country in the world except like Iran and North Korea. They have all agreed that they will recognize a right of quotation. And that quotation right, if you look at it closely, is very close to fair use. Most of the fair uses that we see in our practice could be described as quotations. And so, you've at least got the beginning of an argument in most countries for a right to quote other people's material as part of your new work.
We had a couple questions about specific types of materials and
Mm.
especially newspapers. I think we've covered that government publications are usually going to be public domain. I think we've had that one answered in the chat, but anything about those two types that you want to highlight?
Newspapers are great because, I'm bound by, I think they'd kick me out of the bar. I'm not allowed to be a lawyer anymore if I tell you that there's an easy answer to this, that there's like a rule that's very simple. But I struggle to find examples of uses of like headlines, for example, or front page spreads that aren't fair use. And that's because of the transformative logic that I described earlier. 99 times out of 100, if you are reproducing a headline or a front page spread, you're not doing it the same day the newspaper came out, right? And you're typically then doing it for sort of like historical criticism and commentary reasons. You're looking back, you're saying, what were people talking about then? What did they care about? And typically nobody's even gonna read it, right? It's splashed on the screen. They see the headline, there's some text, there's a picture. And so it's a pretty easy fair use analysis almost all the time for newspapers. You will never find that written down anywhere. That's not in the law, but it's a natural application of the way fair use works these days. And the government thing is interesting. There's an important nuance to know about that. And Janice has it right. Only federal government works are in the public domain. So, works of the state of Virginia, for example, are not, and now there is an amazing obscure law that, if y'all want to get going on something fun, we could get active about this. Waldo Jaquith, who is an open knowledge activist type guy was in Charlottesville. I think he lives in Charlottesville still. Waldo worked in state government a while back, and like 5, 10 years ago, he got into the Virginia state law that open licenses should be assigned whenever possible to essentially all creations of the Virginia state government. But it has to be implemented by a regulation, and it never was. So for now, the creations of the Virginia state government are all protected by copyright, but by state law, arguably, they could be made open, which would be amazing.
We will look for that in future legislative sessions.
Yeah.
It would be great to see that come up again.
Yeah.
Our next question is about the AI craze and how that has sort of muddled the waters further in the sort of digital world. And where do things sit legally with the discourse around AI, especially how they just scrape all the content.
Yeah, so that was the panel I was on this afternoon in Washington, D.C. And it's a muddle. It's a muddle in the sense that, there isn't literally an answer from the courts yet. There are a lot of cases murking their way through. But I would say at the same time, from the point of view of the big principles of fair use, the things that we've talked about tonight, I think the vast majority of AI sort of training uses are going to be fair uses. And that's for the same reason that internet search is a fair use, and the same reason that the HathiTrust digital library is a fair use, and the Google Books search tool is a fair use. And that's because when you digitize a bunch of material behind a curtain, as it were, people aren't reading this stuff. OpenAI doesn't publish its data set. Nobody can see what they're training on. And what you get on the other side, again, is not a copy of the book or even a useful excerpt from the book, but rather something else, some new generative material. Well, then that's adding new meaning, new messages, new value. It's not a substitute in the sense that copyright cares about, it's a new thing. And so I think AI generally is going to end up being in the fair use tent. The creations of AI, and I think Adrian mentions that, that's going to actually, I think, be much messier. Right now, the Copyright Office has said, oh, if a work is created purely by AI, like you put a prompt into, Stable Diffusion, you say, oh, draw me an elfin prince, in front of a castle, and it does that. That image is born into the public domain. It does not qualify for copyright because under the Constitution, copyright is only for authors. And the Copyright Office has said that's human authors. The work of a machine doesn't qualify. But I think what we'll see, and what we already see, it's been true probably for like a decade actually, is that AI plays a small role in making larger works, right? Something like a graphic element in a film. And so the film will, of course, be eligible for copyright. And maybe there's some little AI piece of it that's not, but we'll never be able to even know which part that is, and it won't really matter. So I think the question of AI protection, copyright protection for the creations of AI is going to get swallowed up because the creations of AI are going to become part of human creations writ large. But it's going to be interesting. Every case will be different.
I think one case I had seen in the courts currently was brought from an artist who found that people were using her name in the prompts they were writing to mimic her specific style. So it would be great if they could do something to keep the prompts from allowing that sort of mimicry of a particular person's style. But I don't know how that will come through.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. There's not going to be, I mean, I hate to say it, there's not going to be a copyright answer to that question because copyright doesn't protect style, and thousand artists have gotten jobs in the past by saying, I can make you a painting that looks like, an old Fillmore poster, right? Or whatever. Like thousand clients have said, I'm hiring you because I can't afford them, but can you give me something that kind of looks like what they do? So I think we'll find that AI is able to do that just as well as human artists, or not just as well, maybe not as well at all, but there's never been a copyright bar. Nobody could ever sue somebody else saying you took my style. Style has always been something that people can sort of imitate and use. But there is something kind of icky about being able to use someone's name in a prompt. So it may be that there's something other than copyright that can come into play in that context. We'll see. Yeah, you can't. It's right, Janice. You're sort of on the right track. It's not something you could copyright. I don't think you could even patent a style because I suppose it's a process, but I don't know. I may be getting out of my league talking about patents, but I'm not optimistic about patenting a style either. I think style is probably going to stay beyond the realm of IP. I see Marianne mention the Public Records Act, local and state records, and it's true, but it's interesting, and we've had clients, I worked on an amazing show that you should watch if you get a chance called Exposed: Naked Crimes. And it's a hilarious sort of reality-based show, but they get a lot of content by FOIA requests. And when they first, sort of retained us to represent them, they were treating everything they got by FOIA as if it were in the public domain. And we had to sort of correct that. There's a big difference. Again, works of the state government are still copyrighted. So the question is not, so you can't sort of treat them as just free to use. They're free for you to access. You can get a copy. You're entitled to see it. But whether you use it depends again on a fair use analysis. Now, fair use is pretty friendly to this kind of stuff. Police don't wear body cameras so that they can sell the proceeds to a show. It's a pretty transformative use, in other words, to show police body cam footage. But, technically it is copyrighted material.
I think for me, one thing was surprising. What surprised me about your presentation was that it was not the amount, like a percentage of what we could use, that was part of the fair use evaluation, but rather, again, that transformative use. So I think that is good to keep in mind. You can perhaps use more than you thought you could.
Absolutely. And, that's especially useful in archival materials, images. It's rare that you use less than entire image, a photograph or something like that. But that's okay. You can use the entire photograph if it's for a transformative purpose. And same with, songs like the J.M. Gates song, that was a pretty long, we hear rules of thumb, 10 seconds of music is okay, but anything more than that and you're in trouble. None of that is true. None of that is real. There are no numbers in the statute. And as you heard, we felt very comfortable letting that J.M. Gates record roll on because it was really powerful and, again, doing something new in the show.
And that was such a wonderful example because it's got the audio and it's got the newspaper headlines and clippings and also archival images. So it really brings so many elements together. So thank you for sharing that with us. Well, I think we are wrapping up. Lots of great comments in the chat there for you, Brandon. This has been very informative. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks so much, y'all. It's great to be here.